We would like to welcome you in our exhibition, Evolution. Our exhibition showcases LW design research from the universities of the RCA, the Kingston, and the UAL. Tonight, we are glad to have with us Kevin Walker. Kevin is a researcher, a designer, writer, and artist. He's also the dean of the course Information Experience Design at the School of Communication of the RCA. His work is at the boundaries of the physical and digital, and specifically in curation and computation in physical spaces, grounded in cognitive and cultural theory. He's also my PhD supervisor, and we're excited to hear what he has to say to us about the experience beyond human. So, welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for coming. So this is organized by the London Doctoral, thank you, by the AHRC, and so I supervise 3 students funded under this program, including Kelly, Claire, who I saw, and Federico, all of whom I will mention. I won't show their work because you'll be able to see it across the road after this. So I'll report some research that I've done, so some original findings, some preliminary findings I'll report for the first time. I will also discuss some research methods might be useful to PhD students, and then some of the findings might inform experience design, say more in a commercial sense or an artistic sense. So hopefully you find something useful. Okay, so experience. It's become this overused buzzword, and it's used in so many different contexts in so many different ways that it's become almost meaningless. Not only in a commercial context, but in an artistic context as well. So experiential art is a thing, has been for a decade or so, and so because I run a program with experience in the name, it's important to us, and we do this all the time, to define and redefine what exactly this means. So defining what is experience. So I asked this simple question to start off with, and so I devised a kind of research project. I came up with specific research questions, which are the following. So how has experience been defined in HCI specifically, specifically in experience design and user experience, so UX and XD? Then how do these definitions compare with definitions from philosophy and anthropology, so traditional definitions going back a bit further? Then can we pull out mechanisms of experience that might be used to study them, to design them? And then could we pull together some characteristics of a kind of framework that might be used to research and to perhaps design experiences? So these were the questions that I started out with, and what I did then was undertook a systematic review of the literature around experience in 2 areas, HCI in general, human-computer interaction, and design. So looking through the academic literature, conference papers, journal articles, and books as well, that focused explicitly on experience, so that had experience in the title and had experience as a focus of the content. I limited my search to the past decade to get kind of the latest thinking in this area. And then I used a method called backchaining, which is where you look through the citations to see who's being referenced, so you can find the sort of foundational references in this area. So I went backwards to find the sort of key papers and books that everyone was referring to with regard to experience. I then cross-referenced these definitions that I found against the ones from anthropology and philosophy to come up with some sort of new or holistic definition that might be useful. So here are some of the things that I looked at. within HCI, for example, within experience design. So things around branding, things around user experience, these sorts of academic papers. And what emerges from this literature is something like the following. In HCI, you find lots of related terms. So aesthetics comes up quite a lot. Affect, emotion, appeal, engagement. It's often about enjoyment and fun. So there was a shift in the last decade or two where the user experience around technology shifted from functionality and usability to user experience and enjoyment. Are people enjoying the sort of interactions with whatever technology? So is it fun? Hedonic is another word, interestingly, that comes up. Flow is an interesting one I'll come back to. So the one conclusion, and coming from several of these papers actually, is that this experience is not really well understood. No one's really properly looked into this. There was a lack of understanding in the underlying experience, the processes of experiences, that we needed to look deeper into the theories. So that kind of validated what I was doing. So then I went to the philosophy literature and anthropology. So my background is anthropology and a million other things, journalism, art, design, research. But I've got a degree in anthropology, so I looked at some anthropological sources on experience. So Victor Turner being one of the most prominent from anthropology. And then when you look into this word experience, all roads lead to John Dewey. So from 1920s, 30s, he wrote several books on experience. Art as Experience is probably the most prominent. Yeah, Dewey. So I looked at things like this, but if you're a contemporary researcher or student, you'll know that these are sort of old white men. So I also looked at some more contemporary philosophy, and any MA students here will know that this is basically our reading list that I'm showing. So contemporary philosophers, feminist theory, Karen Barad, Jane Bennett. This is what's called new materialism, sort of post-humanist approaches, and then looked at non-Western approaches as well. These two books are both great, super interesting. And then looked at other things like these. Alvanoe, I'll come back to. Federico is one of my PhD students and a pretty well-known contemporary philosopher as well. This book came out this year, and it's really, really good. I'm only about halfway through it. But I would certainly recommend it. And I don't know it well enough to refer to it much in here, but I'll come to that in future talks and things like that. But highly recommended for sure. So these are the philosophy things I looked at. So let's come to some sort of definition of experience. What does it mean? We can sort of break it down in three different ways to me. So you can treat it as a verb. So to experience something, we all experience things every day. In this sense, it's a very subjective process, so it's different for everyone. We can think of experiences, and Dewey talks a lot about this, having an experience. We can have an experience. We have lots of experiences in our life. So this can be called objective, and I put that in quotes because it's a sort of bounded thing that we might be able to look at from outside and contain and maybe even design. And then I like to look at things in terms of time instead of as static things, because everything changes through time. And when you do that with experience, you get to this notion of experiencing, or experience as a continual sort of flowing process that's constantly going and constantly changing. So we'll come back to the notion of time shortly. What this all sort of flags up is the limitations of language. So I'm talking to you, obviously, in human language, in English, in words, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but when we put things into words, it's an interpretation. So it's getting away from some sort of pure experience, if we can say that. So recognizing that's a limitation of this kind of research when we're looking at experience which seems to be inherently free of language or resisting language. So to limit my study, I focused only on individual experience, not co-experience, as it's sometimes called, collective social experiences. And I avoided sort of common uses of the terms. So the experience of, say, using an app, something like that. Or when people said users had a positive experience. So I avoided things like that to focus on these three top definitions. Right. So what does it mean to experience? I'm going to show you some work from MA and PhD students throughout this, alongside things. So in the literature, you'll also see this word ineffable. That means something that's not definable, something you can't put into words. So experience is often sort of counterposed against interpretation, so putting things into language, with experience transcending language somehow, and interpretation always relying on language. It's sometimes described in terms of the ineffable, something cannot be put into words. So experience, as I said, is subjective. We can never sort of step out of experience and look at it in a detached way. In a direct, it's a direct first-hand and first-person phenomenon. As such, it's by nature subjective and, importantly, controlled by the individual. It's also embodied, so most approaches to experience in HCI literature certainly tend to be cognitive and focused on people's sort of mental experience of software. And lots of research ignores the body. It also tends to be focused on objects and products, and that includes Dewey, actually. So in Art as Experience, he defines art as, a painting or a sculpture. So he's quite dated in his sort of understanding. It was 1934 that book was written. So it's before, more contemporary notions of art as we would understand them. Yeah, the body is still lacking from a lot of research, and Claire, one of the PhD students, works on this. You'll see her work over the road. I think you're running a workshop as well, yes? Friday. Thank you. Friday 2 to 5 here somewhere.
Upstairs, if you search on Eventbrite, you can find it. See me at the show and I'll tell you.
Okay, grand. I mentioned to Claire the other day this guy named Moshe Feldenkrais. He came originally from the Ukraine. World War II, he worked on sort of sonar systems, living in France, and then after the war, moved to the new state of Israel, and became a sort of physical therapist. He came up with this notion of physical therapy that was about becoming aware of your actions. So he said the following: "The execution of an action by no means proves that we know, even superficially, what we're doing or how we're doing it. If we attempt to carry out an action with awareness, that is, to follow it in detail, we soon discover that even the simplest and most common of actions, such as getting up from a chair, is a mystery, and that we have no idea at all how it's done." So this is quite interesting. It's used, interestingly, in the experience design literature, not literally to design experiences, but as a metaphor for sort of changing business processes. So the organization is sort of becoming aware of its movements so it can sort of get to a new place, this kind of thing. So that's interesting, maybe. To experience is not to behave. Behavior implies an outside observer describing someone else's actions. This comes from the anthropology literature, Victor Turner. Experience is more personal. It refers to an active self, to a human being who not only engages in action, but shapes an action. We can have an experience, but cannot have a behavior. We describe the behavior of others, but we can characterize our own experience. It's also not perception as such. So Alva Noe calls perception bringing the world into focus. Calls experience, rather. Not something that happens inside of us as a result of being affected by the world around us, because we see much more than is sort of projected to the eyes, he says. We experience what's hidden or occluded, say the back of something. We experience the nature of things, or what they are, say telephones, water bottles, other people. We perceive emotion and meaning, the intensity of a person's concentration, what she is saying, things like that. I should explain, sorry, before we leave this video, this done by an MA student who traveled to Israel, to Jerusalem, and ended up making this as her final MA project. And what's happening here is you have people from 3 different faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all taking place in this ritual that she designed. So what she found in her research, she looked at sort of common gestures that were used in the 3 religions, in rituals in the 3 religions. And she designed this ritual to be done in a sort of non-denominational way. She designed some objects. Water, she found, was prominent in all 3 religions. And so she designed this as a performance, and along with some objects. She lives now in Jerusalem as well, and does research, and is quite a good artist as well. Comes from a textile background. Okay, so the experiencing body is situated in the world, in particular social and physical contexts. The scope of experience is thus a matter of what's available to us, according to Alva Noe, a matter of particular contexts, and it depends on what we can do. What we can do then depends on understanding and know-how, but also on tools and technology, and on where we find ourselves and what environmental and social resources are available to us. So the HCI literature is overwhelmingly focused on the sort of tools and technology that mediate our relations with the world. This model comes from a couple of American researchers looking at learning in museums and different contexts that people operate in. The personal context is really what encompasses experience. It's situated with or in these other contexts. So you can imagine sort of a person being in the middle of that, and that learning or meaning making happening in the overlap of these contexts. And then, of course, changing over time. Experience produces enduring changes, not only to the subject. The world is changed by the outcome on the world of the total action, and also by the changes brought about in the experiencer, if we can say that. So philosopher William James provides a view I find useful. He says, it doesn't make sense to think of spaces, bodies, or things. There's only pure experience, of which everything else is composed. One experience is the knower, the other is the reality known. So the individual exists in the world, but the world encountered also exists inside the head of the individual. The experience consists of both thing and thought, percept and concept, content and consciousness. Experiences that act, that have consequences in the world, versus those that do not, thoughts. Things both are and are known, and truth is then both subjective and objective, he says. So what Noe calls bringing the world into focus necessarily involves some process of mental translation. Instead of translation, I like the term transduction, because it has a kind of shared meaning across different scientific fields. We can separate that again into interpretation and understanding. So according to philosopher Richard Schusterman, interpretation relies on words, whereas understanding does not. So a shudder, a tingle might be enough to indicate that one has understood. Some of the things we experience and understand are never captured by language, not only because their particular feel defies adequate linguistic expression, but because we're not even aware of them as things to describe. And this is sort of supported by neuroscience, that how we feel affects the way we interpret internal and external signals, and our interpretations then affect the way that we feel. The why of experience, let's see if this video plays. The why of experience is strongly correlated to critical understanding. So according to Noe, again related to emotion, how we feel about what we encounter. Perceiving is an activity of securing access to the world by cultivating the right critical stance, that is, cultivating the right understanding. So Noe relates this to the experience of looking at artwork as well as experience in general. So how can we sort of access experience? So we'll talk about some specific methods that have been used in the research. Experience, if it's sort of more than the sum of its parts, a sort of irreducible totality of people acting, sensing, thinking, feeling, making meaning in a setting, how could we possibly capture that? Lots of people use video or some sort of sensing technology. We're doing a kind of combination here, tracking people in a space. So this was an experiment we did to track where people went according to sort of content we were showing in different parts of the space, so to track their movements throughout the space. So you can use these sorts of techniques. What's called talk aloud protocols are very common. So someone's undertaking some kind of experience, they're doing whatever, and you get them to talk about what they're doing as they're doing this. Stories, diaries are very common, so having people write or record somehow what they are experiencing or what they have experienced. Questionnaires, of course, used quite a lot. Something called experience reports, which is basically a kind of diary or questionnaire. And then something called experience sampling, which is when someone's immersed in something and you give them a sort of short survey to fill in while they're doing this. And some of you might know cultural probes, which is creating some sort of object, not as a design object, as a finished thing, but as a piece of research that you give to someone, a participant, to use as a way of collecting data yourself. So, for example, a disposable camera, objects, making things out of clay, all these sorts of things. So cultural probes are often used in this sort of process. One of my now former PhD students, John, had people create these sort of network maps, so externalizing their experience of digital systems. In this case, it's social networks, so getting them to make physical models of social networks. 2- and 3-dimensional representations of digital experiences. And he found that these had a kind of effect of unflattening experience off of the screen. It enabled people to have a kind of reflective critical distance from their immediate effects. And it generated new metaphors that were useful in accessing understanding non-verbally. Caroline, another PhD student, current PhD student, is looking at emotion, and lots of researchers have tried to sort of untangle emotion from experience and to try to somehow measure emotion. Dewey said that emotions are not things, but qualities of experience that change over time. And therefore, if we try to capture discrete instances of emotional states, this has very limited use. Her research involved participants, for example, using color, making drawings to sort of convey their emotional states. And then she then translated this into having people create objects, dimensional objects, based on that. And then there's an issue here, though, because feelings can be very different from when they're experienced in the moment, in the experience itself, and then when they're recounted afterwards. So we tend to evaluate based on what happened during the latter parts of an experience, for example, and we remember the most intense levels of experience. We can have a reasonably good time overall, but if it ended abruptly or if it ended badly, that's all we take away from the experience. So there's a problem in that kind of post-reconstruction of emotion. So what she did next, she makes prototypes with people in participatory workshops to convey emotion in various low-tech and high-tech ways. So in order to sort of construct a useful working definition of experience, I like the term expression. This comes again from Victor Turner, the anthropologist, and it encompasses any kind of externalization or manifestation of experience. It can be written, constructed, performed, and so on. And expression also sort of conveys the emotional quality of experience. And engaging in expression, even completing a survey, let's say, itself constitutes an experience, the experience of describing, not the experience being described. Expressions, as Turner says, must then be enacted to be experienced themselves. But these are usually bounded, so they're easier to study than the sort of continuous flow of experience, though it does lose the vitality of that continuous flow. So about flow, we come to this notion of time. What William James calls pure experience is always constructed in the present. The experience of another thing as an external, objective reality may have existed in the past, so this room has existed, say, for, 60, 70 years, but our experience of this room may not have existed until now. But how long is the now? What does this mean exactly? What exactly is the present? This is a huge metaphysical question we don't have time to get into because physicists don't even understand time completely themselves. But there's a psychologist in the US named Mark Whitman who gives actually a very precise answer to this question. The present is 2.5 seconds, he says. This is the time that it takes for us to sort of process things into words, into language, to understand things linguistically. It also happens to correlate with the average time to refresh a social media feed. Also, the average time that people look at an artwork in a museum, for example, or a gallery. So super interesting. 2.5 seconds is the present, according to him. So if we say that experience is exactly the link between past and present, it's continuous and it's cumulative. It consists of past experience, contextual knowledge in the present, and anticipated reactions. Anthropologist Edward Brunner points out a paradox, though. He says, although life is a flow, we can never experience that flow directly because every observed moment is a remembered moment. Temporal succession cannot be experienced as such because the very observation of time fixes our attention and interrupts the flow of experience, leading to periods of reflexivity when the mind becomes conscious of itself. So this sort of puts into question methods like talk aloud protocols that interrupt the flow by asking participants what they're doing. There are some things that I've used, for example, called experience recording technologies, so various types of sensors and things like that, even video to some extent, but then people's awareness of them then changes their behavior and their experience, the experience itself. So, and it also raises huge ethical issues. So if we can only enter the world in the middle, in the present, according to Brunner, then stories serve as meaning-generating interpretive devices which frame the present within a hypothetical past and an anticipated future. The transformation of our experience over time, Kelly, you'll remember this one, can be called learning. Dewey discusses experiential learning, which involves direct bodily engagement with phenomena. This then relates to another definition of experience, life experience. So then we come on to this notion of experience as a noun, experiences. That video doesn't want to play. An experience is a stream that has sort of coalesced into something with a beginning, middle, and end, which can be named, talked about, and evaluated. So there are related terms in the literature for an experience, an activity, an encounter, an episode, a situation. Snapshot versus a movie is a common metaphor. Experience also has an emotional quality that sets it apart from the stream of experience, from everyday situations like work. It has a wholeness, it's a kind of consummate example of a type. As Dewey says, that was an experience. So it's things that we talk about like that. And as I said, the user experience research has overwhelmingly described positive emotions in relation to technology acceptance and use. But we all know that learning the hard way, as we call it, involves sometimes negative experiences, negative emotions. There's a very small but interesting area called uncomfortable user experience, which is testing the boundaries of this and putting people in delicate situations in an ethically acceptable way, let's say. Okay, so aesthetics is another sort of common word associated with experience. Dewey, of course, art as experience, he defined art as refined and intensified forms of experience, not only for those who experience art, but also those who create it, for whom making is an experience as well. We could substitute the word designer for artist exactly the same. And in fact, in my program, as you see, we don't make much of a distinction between the two. An emotional response is the conscious sign of a break. Any experience that does not violate expectation, says the philosopher Hegel, is not worthy of the name experience. That's a bit loud. In an experience, flow is from something to something, says Dewey. There are no holes, no mechanical junctions, no dead centers when we have an experience. There are pauses, places of rest, but they punctuate and define the quality of movement. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, if I pronounce that correctly, uses the term flow to describe states of internal motivation. So he's really mainly interested in sort of optimizing performance. But he wrote this really interesting paper with Kim Hermansen, where he created a model for the design of what he calls flow experience. This is based on intrinsic motivation, and it includes, as you see, sensory, emotional, and intellectual means of involvement, and it suggests that some sort of balance between expectation and novelty characterize good sort of flow experience. So he has this interesting model. You can look it up if you're interested in that. We might say, so concluding sort of defining experience, that from all of this, that experience design is a kind of an oxymoron. You can't really design experience. If it's subjective to every person, what can you do? You can only sort of facilitate. You can craft experiences, maybe. You can design situations, contexts, interfaces, artifacts, of course, sort of levers that people can interact with rather than sort of neatly predicted outcomes. You can provide resources through which people can structure their experiences, but I would say you can't sort of design experience or experiences. But it's useful, again, to look at design as a verb instead of a noun as well. So experience design not as a monolithic sort of field or entity, but designing as a process of making things is maybe a better way to think about it. So you can think of experience prototyping, which is a method that's used. You can think of research through design, which is a growing method within HCI as well. Flow. I'm going to skip this one actually and come to transactions. The relations between designer, object or system, and user can be characterized as transactions. Why transactions? There's a guy named David Kolb, an education researcher, wrote a book called Experiential Learning. He said he likes this word transactions because he says interaction is somehow too mechanical, involving unchanging, separate entities that become intertwined but retain their sort of separate identities. For him, transaction implies a more fluid relationship in which both sides are changed. But what does this mean? If interaction is too mechanical, might transaction be too monetary? What exactly is exchanged in these transactions? Here we interrogate another term that comes up frequently in the literature, value. Successful experiences somehow must be valuable to users. It's often said in the literature. What does that mean? So we can talk about value, we can talk about values, two quite different meanings. What this means is a kind of asymmetry between one side and the other. So in information or perceived value, one side has more information or intangible value, and the other side is prepared to conduct some sort of transaction for that value, whatever it is. Intangible value can be subjective qualities, emotional, psychological needs, things like that. And of course, the monetary aspect is prominent and has been ever since these guys wrote this book in, I think, 1990 something or early 2000s. This kind of kicked off the whole experience design thing, actually. So these are their sort of bullet points. This is what you do to design an experience. You theme the experience, you fulfill it in all its details. Harmonize the impression with positive cues, again that emphasis on positivity. Federico in his book talks a lot about the sort of enforced fun and positivity in our current sort of reality. And then you mix in memorabilia so people can take something away from the experience. So this has been very influential. This is, you could say, where user value is supplanted in favor of, say, shareholder value, perhaps. It's not about the product, it's not about user experience, but the experience itself becomes the product. Experience design in a commercial sense is really designing systems to deliver value to customers, full stop. But this idea applies not only to commercial enterprise, but also the art world, where, as I said earlier, experience has become a kind of asset to be used and to be traded. But it's not a simple case of like commercial exploitation. We all live and work in a capitalist system, so we all have to somehow make our way within this, unless you're really going out to the woods and going outside of this. If experience is beyond design, then we need to understand the conditions of its production and consumption. The experience of experience, you might say, in terms of the things I've talked about: transduction, expression, transactions, transformation. Hopefully this would advance the knowledge of designers, technologists, business people, anyone else, no matter whether the context is commercial or artistic or other. So where do we go from here? Come back to this question, what exactly is experience? 1996, computer scientist named Terry Winograd proposed that designing for the full range of human experience may be the theme of the next generation of discourse of software design. And indeed, for the next decade, let's say 96 to 2006, emotional design, experience design were entrenched in both design and HCI. But there was a growing concern in the community for the development of user experiences to gain insight in the appraisal of the user of that interaction, as well as the product, the computer in most cases. This was becoming more and more important with the increasing intelligence, so-called intelligence of products. So moving ahead another decade, say roughly to today, human-centered approaches in HCI have come to the fore, but this call for equal attention to users and to products sort of implies placing them on an equal level. So that raises the question then, based on what I've just talked about, based on this review I've done of the literature and of anthropology and philosophy, might it now be time to reverse these roles and more broadly to view experience from the perspective of particular entities, whether they're human or not? This is something that Kelly looks at in her research. Might humans be regarded as products? Might agency be assigned to non-human things? If experience is beyond design, is it beyond humans? Is design only a human endeavor? We can come to this first question, the last question first. Philosopher Daniel Dennett regards design as a process, again, time-based verb, not a static noun, a process undertaken by nature as well as humans. He frames design by humans as what he calls intelligent design, and design by nature as what he calls competence without comprehension. Other contemporary theorists, Jane Bennett, Tim Ingold, Timothy Morton, regard things and materials as having some sort of vital agency equal to that of humans. So can non-human things experience? Can they have experiences? Well, we've distinguished non-linguistic understanding from interpretations, expressions, let's say. J.J. Gibson, in his theory of affordances, talks about the things in the environment that afford action to individuals, and he talks mostly in terms of animals, not always in terms of humans. He talks about social affordances in terms of humans, but most of the time he's talking cross-species. What about non-living things? Can they experience? Dewey offers the following story. Imagine a stone rolling down a hill to have an experience. Let's add by imagination the idea that it looks forward with desire to the final outcome, and that it's interested in the things it meets along the way, conditions that accelerate or slow down its movement, and that the final coming to rest is related to all that went before, to the culmination of a continuous movement and one with an aesthetic quality. So Dewey here is using the philosopher's tool of the thought experiment, obviously. He's asking us to use our imaginations. But we can say here he's making a link with design. We could say equally with art, because they exist by definition as enactments of imagination. It's putting imagination into practice. Maybe on a more sort of empirical level, some of my research has treated non-living artifacts as having personal, social, physical context, just like humans might. So we can think maybe in terms of systems. We find this useful. Benjamin Bratton points to rapid advances in machine learning combined with shrinking hardware to suggest that a human-centered approach is insufficient for understanding the increasingly global, distributed nature of computing systems. At the other end of the scale, individual humans as systems are composed of smaller systems, and both HCI and design still largely ignore the role of the body, as I said. According to the neuroscientist Leah Kelly, the brain has sort of taken center stage as the organ of perception, interpretation, learning, memory, emotion, decision-making, and initiation of action. But these processes occur in all cells. she says the neuroscientist. Within the body, she says, the immune system specifically, she calls our sixth sense, distinguishes between the self and the other. It's only by experiencing the outside on the inside that we can acquire the knowledge to become ourselves, she says. So we live with millions of other individuals inside of us, outside our bodies, in our homes. We're exposed to millions of them every day. As William James says, the world moves in us and through us. So we come to this question of temporality. We're coming to the end now. Everything in systems theory is temporary. So the Norbert Wiener, who came up with sort of cybernetics and systems theory, said, "We are but whirlpools in a river of ever-flowing water," according to him. We're not stuff that abides, but patterns that perpetuate themselves. And contemporary philosopher Karen Barad therefore suggests we speak not of things, but of meanings, not of matter, but of mattering. Meanings come into being through connections and performance. So what does all this mean? Why would we want to give non-human actors equal status? What benefits might come from transposing subject and object? The increasing turn to the material and the non-human in the social sciences and design has coincided with a continued rapid technological development commensurate with growth of US technology companies, increasing ubiquity of technologies, the collection of data about people, technological domination of human attention. This has all been recently documented in the press and elsewhere. Humans have already become instrumentalized, as Federico Campagna says in his book. Much user experience work, including our own research from years back, experience recording stuff, was done before the Snowden revelations that exposed, raised critical awareness of the sort of dark side of big data. So just as Dewey's art as experience has become experience as product, we could say Gibson's view of what humans afford to others can now be viewed economically when the others are digital technologies. We already design for machines, sometimes to the marginalization of humans and non-humans. So our approach is to look at phenomena from the perspective of other things, sometimes from the perspective of technologies, of computers. We have a methodology called decomputation, which is looking at things from computers' perspective as a critical practice, for example. Designing with and for natural things, bees, mushrooms in this case. These two students, incidentally, have a show, graduates rather, have a show over in Shepherd's Bush where they're designing a new language, not for humans, but for the far future, where they're starting with these sort of sea sediments and these little microbes that live on the bottom of the ocean. And individually, they're sort of microscopic, but collectively, they make these large structures you can see from space. And the sea sediments, you take a core sample of the seabed, and you have this sort of enormous, long history of life on Earth. And so they're designing a kind of language for these organisms, or some organism in the future, to read. And it's a super interesting question, you know. If we assume that computers, say, can read symbols, can understand language to some degree, it's not unreasonable to assume that in the far distant future, someone or something will understand and read the things that we're doing here today. So what might seem like crazy art school experiments might have long-term implications and consequences that we're not aware of. That's it. Thank you.